Good evening and welcome, one and all. What a gift it is to be together this evening to honor and celebrate our friend and colleague, Doug Miller. I'm the Reverend Tamara Casanova Suzuki, the minister here at Live Oak Unitarian Universalist congregation. The good people of this congregation are pleased to welcome the Santa Barbara Interfaith community to this special night as we share together an evening with Doug. Our membership is pleased to be hosting you, and you can recognize Live Oakers, at least some of them, by the tags that they're wearing this evening. I just wanted to share that this evening with Doug was conceived of and is being produced by Marty Jenkins, who's an active member of Live Oak and who works with Doug through Showers of Blessings and shares with Doug a passion for supporting people without houses. Both men are active in the interfaith community and supporting social justice causes. And Marty describes his expectation and desire for tonight being a heartful evening. And it is an act of love, appreciation, and admiration for Doug. And you'll hear a bit from Marty a bit later. We're particularly pleased this evening to welcome Doug's family, and I think they're sort of scattered about. So I know Sandy's over there. Oh, they're all over there. So his wife, Sandy, who co-founded Showers of Blessings with Doug and is the supplies manager. And we also welcome Christine and Jeffrey and their chosen son, JJ. Everyone's here. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for the evening, Pastor Roy Donkin of Cambridge Drive Community Church. Roy is uniquely qualified to fill this role this evening, as Roy, as well as his wife Cheryl, were students of Doug's at Eastern Baptist Seminary, and Roy is now Doug's pastor. Roy has been a leader in our local interfaith community and served for a number of years as the president of the Interfaith Initiative of Santa Barbara County, as well as the Clergy Association of Santa Barbara. So welcome all, welcome Doug, our honored guest this evening, and welcome Roy.
When Marty asked me if I would do this introduction of Doug, I was honored and nervous. Some folk are so good at doing these things. And so I began to wrestle with what I would say, and I thought I could tell you about Doug's education, his impeccable evangelical credentials from college at Wheaton, seminary at Fuller, and then he kind of fell off the wagon and went to Claremont Graduate School for his PhD and did some postdoctoral work at Harvard. I could tell you about his 20 years of teaching at Eastern Seminary, where he held the chair of Christian social ethics. I could tell you about scores of articles that he's written in Christianity Today, the American Baptist Journal, and the number of entries that he had in the Evangelical Dictionary of Theology. I could tell you about presentations made to diverse groups, including the American Psychiatric Association. I'm really curious of what he said to them. Colleges, seminaries, and many denominational events. I could tell you some things that wouldn't be so easy for most of us to know, that he received the Peace Award from the Chapel of the Four Chaplains in Philadelphia. You all know that Doug was for a while the pastor at First Baptist here in Santa Barbara, was the co-founder of the Santa Barbara affiliate of Habitat for Humanity, and chaired the selection committee for their first two projects. He is co-chair of HEAL Goleta, co-founder of Showers of Blessings, and the first general manager of Showers of Blessings. That Doug and Sandy together received the Catholic Charities Partnership Award, which really becomes impressive when you learn that they were the first non-Catholics ever to receive that award. any of us who've been to their beautiful home see built into that place where they live their commitment to providing something that is very, very rare here in Santa Barbara, and that is affordable housing. We could talk about Doug's books. Jesus Goes to Washington, which is for sale out there. $15, Doug?
Yeah, but it's sliding scale.
Sliding scale, so don't let the price stop you from getting one. Or his new book that we'll be talking about tonight. You probably have seen the quote that went by up there from Tony Campolo, where he says, "In this book, Doug Miller does the work of a prophet who comes with a sledgehammer to smash the false idols that we have constructed in place of the biblical Jesus. With the insights of an academic, but in the language of a typical layperson, he deconstructs the American Jesus in order to clear the way for us to encounter the true historical Jesus as revealed in Scripture." I could tell you that Doug has been on the front lines, representing the Clergy Association, the Interfaith Initiative, and other ecumenical and interfaith bodies here in Greater Santa Barbara, speaking truth to power before the cities of Goleta and Santa Barbara and the county of Santa Barbara. I could tell you how Doug is an amazing example of how to hold one's own faith deeply and authentically while also respecting, appreciating, and valuing the faiths of others, and working together with people of other faiths to make our community a better place to live, an example of the blessed community. I could do all those things, but I'm not going to. Instead, I'm going to tell you some things that the only other person in the room could tell you would be my wife, Cheryl, because we were both students of Doug's. I met Doug 41 years ago at Eastern Baptist Theological Seminary. And it was a different place and time for seminaries. At that point in time, the vast majority of students at Christian seminaries had come directly from college. So they came to seminary still carrying remnants of a Sunday school faith. Eastern Seminary, while at that time I would say it represented the best parts of the Baptist tradition, it still was right of center and very much in the evangelical line of thought. Many of the students came from very conservative roots. And here was this school that sat on the borderline between a very poor section of West Philadelphia and the very moneyed part of Philadelphia known as the Main Line. It was a multicultural and multiracial student body. It was a time when the first real wave of women were feeling a call to Christian ministry and showing up in seminaries. And there these conservative students showed up and had their lives rocked. They went to the biblical department and they were told for the first time in their lives to read Scripture with a critical eye. They faced a diversity of thought and cultures that they hadn't experienced before, most of them. And then they showed up in their first Christian social ethics class. And a professor named Doug Miller challenged them to see the world through new, wiser, more compassionate eyes. I think probably every week the dean and the president of the seminary had some student knocking on their door to complain about this heretical professor who was calling them to question deeply held assumptions that they thought were the definition of what it meant to be a Christian. I remember once in class, Doug said, now remember, this was 1975, 76. Doug said, "It's not possible to be both a Christian and a Republican." Now, he tells me he doesn't remember saying that. And to be truthful, I don't remember the context. He may have winked, but I know Doug. I don't think he did. But I can tell you what he was doing to us at that point. He was telling us that we needed to wrestle with the public policy implications of the faith we claimed to hold. I'm sure the dean heard about that one. One of his most notorious classes was a class on the ethics of sex. Again, remember the time frame. One of the assignments that class had every time it was offered was that the students had to go visit an adult bookstore. This was pre-internet days. Pornography was not nearly as ubiquitous as it is now, and for many of these students, these were things they had never seen before. And Playboy magazine was about as racy as anyone had ever experienced. Imagine these wide-eyed students, male and female, running to the dean's office or calling their conservative home pastors to complain about this professor who was polluting them. Cheryl had a class on the ethics of love with Doug, where they talked again, 1975-76, in an evangelical seminary about LGBT issues. They didn't have Q's in those days. And I'm sure that shook the foundations of many of those students, but it also gave one of the students in the class permission to come out of the closet. Doug played what I would argue is the very most important role of a seminary professor to 20 years of students at Eastern. He helped to deconstruct immature faiths so that there would be space for those students to build more mature, robust, and sophisticated ones that were more able to address the needs of a complex and changing society. One of my closest friends was a classmate from my seminary days, and Ben is a brilliant scholar. He's one of the world's foremost experts in intertestamental literature. If you ever have any interest in reading something about Ben Sira, Ben's the person you'll probably read. But Ben came to Eastern planning to be a pastor. Very quickly, it was clear that he had a unique gift with ancient languages. And his biblical professor started to push him. He said, Ben, you should be a scholar. You've got those gifts. But he felt if he went in that direction, he would have been betraying God's call to him. The one professor outside of the biblical department that went to him and said, Ben, it's okay. Follow your gifts. Use those gifts and offer that to the world. And he felt supported by Doug Miller more than any other professor outside of his mentors in the biblical department. I knew that Doug and Sandy were in California. Indeed, part of the time when Doug was at Eastern, he commuted back and forth between here and Philadelphia while he was building their houses. And I hadn't had any contact with him from graduation until we moved here in 2002. And I was thrilled and surprised not only to find Doug and Sandy here, but to see them living everything that he had taught us in our classes. One more personal story. As you heard, Doug and Sandy have been attending Cambridge Drive for a while. And Sandy told me a little story. The first Sunday that they came, she said she leaned over to Doug and said something positive about the sermon. You'll have to ask her what that was. But she said something positive about the sermon, and he leaned back and said, "He was my student." Indeed, I was. And Doug played a significant role in deconstructing my faith so that I would be allowed to build a new one, deeper, richer, more sophisticated, and more compassionate. I was your student, Doug, and I still am. Thank you. I would like to present to all of you my teacher, Doug Miller.
Thank you, Roy. I've never considered myself your teacher, but your colleague. And I've always seen us as in ministry together, even as a student-teacher relationship. We're always colleagues, learning from each other, so thank you. Thank you all for coming. Someone once said, the most joy that a person can have in life is to be surrounded by friends. And I feel very surrounded today by friends. I especially want to thank Marty, a good friend who put this together, worked hard, and I appreciate it, Marty. Thank you so much. I hope you weren't shocked by what you see in my change. It reminds me, my little granddaughter, Roxy, when she was about 5 years old, I was taking a shower, and they're just coming out of it, and she walked into the bathroom just as I was getting out of the shower. I grabbed the towel real quick and covered up, and she said, "Don't worry, Grandpa, I won't laugh." So we all change in life, I suspect. The name of my book that is going to be published by Cascade Publishers is Your Jesus is Too Small, The Collapse of Christian Character. Now tonight, I'm going to broaden that to be more interfaith. So we're going to talk about, is your God too small? Because I think some of the same things that attack Christianity attack all the major religions. And it's good to have Steve and the Imam here, and they're going to maybe share some of these issues that I raise. 50 years ago, J.B. Phillips wrote a little book called Your God is Too Small. Many of us were raised on this book. It was very popular at the time. And he defined certain misconceptions of God, things that belittle God, that trivialize God, and why so many college students were leaving the faith in England and even here in America. He talked about the policeman God and the residential policeman God and the God in a box. That is the God confined to the church, and a half a dozen other misconceptions. And I've tried to continue that on today in our context. But one of the things he said is that this misshapen view of God, this trivializing and belittling of God, also affects our moral sense. So we have a trivialized, shriveled moral character that emerges out of our belittling of God. But 50 years later, we can still ask the question, have we really progressed in our understanding of God? Have we really progressed in our morality? Or are we getting worse morally? And the question is, are we wandering maybe even in a moral wilderness? And the question I'm asking in my book is, does character really count? Does character really count? And the reason I'm asking that question is because of this last election. Just yesterday, the Public Religion Research Institute came out with a study that showed 74% of white evangelicals support Donald Trump. Donald Trump, who has kind of left character, high moral character, in historical wreckage. 55% of all white Catholics support Donald Trump. But what was shocking about this report, just came out yesterday, is that 53% of mainline Protestants support Donald Trump. So what happens to moral character? Now, I noticed that there was a dictionary came out, and there's a new word of the year. Do you remember what it is? Post-truth. Post-truth. And the idea there, the definition of that is that our beliefs and our feelings trump the truth and reality. We're living in a post-truth world. We're living in a world that lacks character, and that does not bode well for massive poverty, for persistent marginalization, for the earth's woes, and for the raging violence in our world. And so the thesis of my book is that building character is a very serious call for today. David Brooks, in his best-selling book, The Road to Character, says that the basis of character is humility. The basis of character is humility. That is, having gone through suffering, having experienced humiliation, so that one can then open themselves to have compassion and the other character traits. He said there's basically 3 ways you build character. One is to model your moral heroes. And our model heroes, if you're religious, is God and those in our faith, Jesus and Moses and Muhammad. And these are the moral heroes and other prophets and so on that are part of our faith. So modeling those heroes. So that's why it's important that we have a high exalted view of God. If we have a trivial view of God, we're going to have a trivial moral character. The second way we build character is to recognize our own vulnerabilities, to realize that we are humble people, that we are suffering people, that we make mistakes, and so on. And the other third thing is that we're other-orientated. That's the basis of building character. That is, that we identify with the sufferings of others, primarily the sufferings of those who are the downtrodden in our society. And in order to do that, you have to have compassion. You have to suffer with others. And that takes humility and strong character. The image of building character is a good image. Building gives the impression that we're in process. We're never complete. We're always trying to get higher, wider on this solid foundation. The foundation for many of us, which is a religious foundation. But there are reasons why we're always in progress. And one of the reasons is human nature. In other words, we're basically, the DNA is we're self-orientated. We're basically narcissistic. In the Christian tradition, we call that the fall or original sin, that we reach out and desire things. We want to be like God. We want to be arrogant. And then we kill, kin kills kin. Cain kills Abel. We end up with raging violence. The other dimension of that, the other reason we talk about building character, is because this selfishness incarnates itself within institutions and primarily our cultures, so that we have what we call various Americanisms, part of the American culture that continually gnaws away at our higher nature and allures our lowest. And I've listed some of these in my book, and the main one is the American dream. You know, we're taught as young kids to follow the American dream, which basically means be wealthy, rich, have a home, have a car, be secure, be prosperous, and so on. There are other Americanisms, the American manifest destiny, American exceptionalism, and American triumphalism. This manifest destiny gave us a special calling to save this land from these savage natives and spread that and redeem this land. The exceptionalism means that our nation is morally, economically, and politically superior to any others. And this triumphalism is because of that we can impose our views upon other people. So this sense of American superiority, American supremacy, is in our genes. And these are character killers. They're character killers. Somebody said Trump is unique. Trump is not unique. The very Americanisms, the very supremacy, because underneath the supremacy is always white supremacy under these Americanisms. So Trump is simply digging out what has always been a part of our culture, American culture. And then there's American frontierism, which our westward pioneering enhanced the spirit of hard work and self-reliance. And then we added to this rugged individualism. And this rugged individualism prioritizes one's own interests versus the Roy called the beloved community. So once again, these are character killers. And then there's American pragmatism, that what's most important is what works, even if it's not based upon moral principle. Again, a character killer. And then there's American capitalism. What is important, or the unregulated ownership of private property and the consumer means of production, and the means of production with strong consumer base, but disproportionately skewed toward the super managers or to those who are wealthy. And this gives rise then, all of these give rise to certain American creedal values. We talk about equality, but we basically mean by that equality of opportunity and not equality of results. We talk about freedom from interference, but not freedom from want and misery. We talk about justice, but basically it's justice and well-being for the rich and not for those who are the underclasses and the minority. And this gives rise then to the American character, which I contrast with the religious character. The American character, which basically has these kinds of traits: self-reliance, self-interest, pragmatism, resilience, material prosperity, independence, persistence, initiative, competition, mobility, hard work, fame, family, and religious devotion. Many of these things are good. Apostle Paul talks about work real hard, but work hard so you can have money to give to the poor. In other words, these values or traditions can be very self-orientated, or they can be other-orientated. And so the American character has been described by Naomi Klein in her recent bestseller as seeing ourselves as little more than singular gratification-seeking units out to maximize our narrow advantage. That's a 50-cent definition if I ever heard of one. David Brooks, in his best-selling books, reduces it to two words: the big me, capitalized. He says that is basically the mentality and the character of the American spirit. I want to share with you a little bit about why these things not only shape our character, they shape our understanding of God, which again reinforces low moral character. It makes God small and trivial. And I want to talk about a few of these that are in my book, but I want to expand them more to an interfaith community. First of all is the fire escape God. Now, fear is a good thing, but there's a lot of false fears, a lot of neurotic fears. I remember as a kid in bed one night, And I thought about, my finger being burnt and how that hurt so bad. Then I thought about my whole arm, my whole body being burned. I said, I couldn't stand it. But then my whole body was going to be burned for an eternity. Can you imagine the suffering and the pain? And even before Pascal's wager, I said to myself, I better not do that. I better accept the Lord Jesus as my Savior so that I won't burn in hell. And probably many of you who are evangelicals came to the Lord for that same reason. But again, this trivializes God, as if God is someone that would allow us to have this kind of torture. No parent would ever allow their child to do that. I've since discovered that really hell is what's on earth. If you look at the biblical understanding of hell, there's 3 or 4 or 5 images: an abyss, Sheol, the grave, a Gehenna, a garbage pit outside the city, an abyss, and a fire. None of these are compatible. How can you have a fire compatible with darkness and a bottomless pit? These are images. They're all images. They're all metaphors. And they're metaphors for what happens outside the beloved community, or as Christians would call it, the kingdom of God, or good governing. That's what hell is. So we trivialize God when we bring that fear into people. And it, again, is a character killer. Then there's the pie in the sky God. That is, I'm a Christian or a religious person because I'm going to go to heaven someday and have a mansion and go through pearly gates and walk on streets of gold. But again, if you look at the biblical view of heaven, heaven always comes to earth. Even the Lord's Prayer, heaven comes to earth. Even in Revelation, the New Jerusalem, all those pearly gates and streets of gold come to earth. That is, heaven is simply another name for what happens within the beloved community. That's what paradise is. That's what heaven is. It's paradise regained. Then there's the prosperity sugar daddy God. And you'll see this a lot on television. One TV evangelist was saying she'd come in today, she saw a big cloud in the sky that looked like a camel. And that was the sign that God was going to bring blessing to you, 800 pounds of blessing to you on his camel. All you have to do, and then I realized where she was going, is you need to send in $80 to get your 800 as seed. And all these evangelists talk about seed money, very seedy approaches to prosperity. And so this pie in the sky, or this prosperity Jesus, is again a way to trivialize God and to make concern for others trivial as well. Then there's the sentimental God. Now, emotionalism is probably a good thing. Emotions are a good thing once in a while. Maybe we should have more of it. But there's some who reduce their faith to emotionalism. I remember as a kid I would sing, I come to the garden alone, and he walks with me and he talks with me and he tells me I am his own. That's very comforting. But is that the only thing Jesus tells me? Does he ever tell me to go out and try to reduce poverty or the earth's woes or the marginalization or to make this a better world? To a sentimental religious person, those issues are never raised. They're never talked about. And so character, again, is crushed. Then there's a stained glass God, the God that's confined to the church. And this we might call the aesthetic God. Aestheticism is very important in our faith. Much of the Hebrew scriptures are written in poetry, very significant and important. But what's really important is that aesthetics become in the service of good and helping others. For instance, the Greek word cologne means both good, and it means beauty. So that all goodness has beauty to it. But again, God is not confined to a church or to religiosity. I love the sign that I once saw as I left the church. It said, "The service has ended, now your service begins." That's the purpose of the church, is to send us out into the world, and just simply to come to church and have prayer, Bible study, listen to a sermon, again, trivializes God. Then there's the doctrinaire God. So many splits in congregations because of doctrines. And there's a whole group in Christianity who are apologists, who want to argue against the atheists. Probably the best argument against any atheist in Christianity is not to try to promote a doctrine, except the doctrine that we ought to get out and love our neighbors and serve our neighbors. That's what's important, not just doctrine in itself. Then there's a legalistic, judgmental God. I remember as a kid, I had all these rules: don't drink, don't smoke, don't chew, and don't go with girls who do. I went to Wheaton College because they had this long code. You couldn't play cards. You couldn't go to the theater and so on. My senior year, Sandy and I went down to Chicago to see the play Sound of Music. And the dean of my college, Wheaton College, heard about it. Now this is my senior year, 3 months to graduate. He calls me in, he says, "We're going to have to dismiss you from Wheaton." And I said, "What?" And he says, "Yeah, we heard that you went to the theater in violation of the code." I appealed it and pleaded ignorance, which I didn't realize, because everybody thought they were talking about the movie theaters. And when I talked about the theater, they said, "Well, okay, we'll let you go." So I was able to graduate. But a legalistic God is also a very judgmental God. Now, there are some good do's and don'ts. We ought probably not to pollute the environment. Not smoking is probably a good thing. But there's also a lot of things that are arbitrary that we're throwing in that trivialize God. Then there's the positive thinking God. Norman Vincent Peale made this very famous. Robert Schuller, in his possibility thinking, made it famous, but it wasn't too possible for him, and he failed. And probably the greatest spokesman for that today is Joel Osteen, who says that God's heavy favor is ready for any of you who reach out and grab it. Not just favor, but God's heavy favor. And this is quite a cruel hoax on most of the people that live in the world today. Now, maybe in America, where there's a little opportunity for a few, this makes sense. If you look at his audience, you'll see the audience that he appeals to. But for most people in the world, it's not heavy favor, but it's heavy hunger and heavy misery and heavy death. That's the world we live in. And this positive thinking, while it's true, we probably ought to think of the cup half full more than half empty. But when we reduce Christianity or any religion to that, we trivialize God. Then there's the anti-intellectual God. I was raised in a tradition where the earth was only 6,000 years old, and we basically denied science. I was shocked to read the other day in a Gallup poll that 50% of the American people believe the earth is only 10,000 years old. Where is science today? This trivializes science. This calls into question astrophysics. It calls into question paleontology. It calls into question archaeology, the whole disciplines. In fact, it brings into question physics and chemistry. It brings all of science into question. And so people are basically climate deniers. They basically deny the importance of vaccinations, even though science has a lot to say. And this again trivializes God, especially when a third of the Hebrew scripture is a wisdom tradition. And there are books that contrast the wise person and the fool, especially Proverbs. And yet we live in a world of fools, and we trivialize God. Jesus was called the wisdom of God. He says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Aristotle once said that to be intellectually dishonest is just as bad as to be morally dishonest. Then there's the magical thinking God. I remember as a kid, we took a trip to California. I was just a young kid at the time. And we happened to pass this front yard where a man had a miniature train that he was riding in and pulling kids in these beautiful colored boxcars like they have over at Stowe House. And I was so impressed and entranced by that the whole trip I prayed constantly that when I got home, that train like that would be in my front yard. And I prayed and I prayed. I didn't know anything else about the trip. I don't remember anything else. And I remember with great anticipation coming into our home, and there was a front yard full of weeds. And I as you can tell, I still remember the disappointment. But it raises the question of magical thinking. You've all been to football games where people are in the, praying for the last minute something. Even we call those last minute plays Hail Marys. And we're all involved in some way in these kind of magical thinking. We have to be careful with prayer. Prayer can also often reduce to magical thinking. The purpose of prayer is for empowerment. Prayer changes people who change things. That's the power of prayer. And prayer is mindfulness, being mindful and becoming involved with the world of which we're a part and how we can make it a better world. Then there's the problem-solving Jesus, or the problem-solving God. There's a book out called Build Your Business on the Principles Jesus Taught, and You'll Be Successful. Well, I built 5 houses in my lifetime, and the only thing I learned from Jesus is don't build a house on sand, but build it on a solid foundation. He didn't give me any engineering plans or anything like that. He gave me courage, possibly, and persistence. But Jesus isn't around, or God isn't around, to solve the problems that we can solve. Then there's the quick fix God. When our daughter Chris was born, she was born with hyaline membrane disease. That's a very deadly disease. 22 people in LA County, we were told, were born with it that month. 21 of them died. It's what took the Kennedy child when he was president, remember? He lost a child through hyaline membrane disease. I prayed and I prayed and I prayed that God would spare Christine. God did spare Christine. But I realized also that our pediatrician was one that Sandy worked for, and it was by her side 24 hours a day. And then when she did expire, she brought her back to life one time. So there was the hand of God and the face of God in a prayer. Then there's the intolerant God. When I was a kid, I learned about all the curses. The curse of Eve. And that affected my view of women and the second-class citizenship of women. Then there's the curse of Ham, which affected my view of African Americans, that they're cursed. Then there was the curse of the Jews. And I remember we had a department store in town called Wheels Department Store, run by a Jewish two Jewish brothers, and my parents would tell me, now, when you walk by their department store, you walk by the curb because they're liable to reach out and pick your pocket. The only time I ever went in that store was to buy a Boy Scout uniform. And eventually I became an Eagle Scout, which I gave up when they took their stand on homosexuality. But Glock and Stark, in their famous book, American Piety, said that the more religious, the more one fulfills the markers of religiosity, the less one loves their neighbor. And Adorno, in his book, The Authoritarian Personality, pointed that out too, that the more religious a person is, the more intolerant and authoritarian they tend to be. So this intolerant God, we see that working out today in very powerful ways with the Trump election. And then there's the end times God. People become fixated with what's going to happen next. And their whole ministry is talking about end times and figuring out the times and so on. Apocalyptic literature was basically literature for the poor to subvert the wealthy, the powerful. It was against Rome, and it was subversive literature. And of course, the big thing today is who's the Antichrist? Well, if you Googled when Obama was in, you understood that he was the Antichrist. Now I challenge you to Google Trump and Antichrist, and you'll come up with hundreds of pages in your Google. In other words, who we don't like is basically the Antichrist. The Antichrist is really those who are opposed to anything Christ-like. That's Antichrist. And when we focus on end times in our religious experience, we basically trivialize God and crush character. Then there's the flag-waving warrior God. I'm glad to see here as a congregation that doesn't have an American flag in it. Us Baptists, we wouldn't think of having an American flag in our churches until World War I. And then to support the war, Christians began to put flags in their congregation. And of course, they wanted something comparable, so they made a Christian red, white, and blue flag they could put in the place of dishonor, while the American flag was in the place of honor. And so after World War I, they just stayed there. World War II, they stayed there. And then today, you can see them in most evangelical churches. And yet again, that's a travesty, because what does that symbolize? It symbolizes God and country, that God somehow considers ourselves a manifest destiny and superior. If you're going to fly a flag in a congregation, it should be a United Nations flag. This is what the Hebrew Scriptures has taught us. We come to Zion so that we don't learn about war anymore. So we learn about peace, so that the lamb can lay down with the lion, and a kid could put their hand in a hole and not be stung by a bee. That's what the purpose of God is, to bring peace. God is a God of peace. And then there's the subdue the earth God. The God who created this earth is a good God, and he created the earth good. God created, I should say she created the earth good. So unfortunately, a lot of religious people are climate deniers and have little regard for the environment. Well, I could say more on that. I just want to say a couple more things. To me, the greatest understanding and the most important concept of God occurred at the Exodus. It's transforming. It's transformed Western history. When God said, I no longer want to be known as El Shaddai, the God of power, the God of the mountain, but I want to be known as Yahweh, the I Am. Because I want to look out and I see my people, I hear their cries, I feel their suffering, I know and experience what they're experiencing. That is, the essence of God changes. Historically, God was always in the service of the wealthy and the powerful. That's why gods were created. Basically, emperors were gods. And the gods were created by the wealthy. So you'd bring all your produce. The masses would bring their produce, they called them tithes, into the storehouses of the wealthy. And so this understanding of God changes Western history. God is now the I am, and later on in Exodus, in speaking to Moses, he says, I am compassionate. I am gracious. I am good. See my goodness. So God now no longer identifies with the wealthy and powerful, but God is an empathetic God, a God of compassion who identifies with the poor and the downtrodden. Unfortunately, the leaders of Israel didn't realize that, and they also embraced the imperial ethic. And that's why the prophetic movement arose, to try to bring the people back to the understanding of God as compassionate and concern and welfare for the marginalized. So that's the first half of my book. The second half of my book is this new understanding of God. We now talk about, and I'm just going to name it, you're going to have to buy the book to see what I have to say about it, but basically they are the kind of character or traits that create a high moral character. The compassionate God, the justice-minded God, the welcoming God, the spirit of the law God, that is, love is the interpreter of the law. The non-materialistic God, material sufficiency is all that God desires. The forgiving God, the truth-seeking God, the peace-loving God, the union of nations God, the creation care God, the politically progressive God, and the character transforming God. This is what makes God, God, the true God. This is what exalts God and doesn't belittle him. Now we live in a day in which many of you have gone through rage, many of you go through resistance, and maybe it's a time for a Thoreau, Martin Luther King moment of civil disobedience, but nonviolence. In Jesus' day, Jesus had two forces he had to struggle against. One was the powerful, rich establishment, and the other, Roman establishment, and the other was the rural resistance who wanted to raise up the sword in violence. And so there's what's called a little apocalypse, Jesus' little apocalypse, in which he says, you shall stand before kings and give them your testimony. The fact that he's standing before kings means he wasn't slaughtered in the rural resistance. The fact that he's standing before kings means that he did resist. And the fact that he's giving a word of testimony means that words will not come back void. And so we need to continue to get out the word, to resist, and to resist even disobediently if necessary, if it comes to that. If we see this being a Thoreau, Martin Luther King moment, and maybe it is. It's up to you and to me. Thank you very much.
Wow. Thanks, Doug. Before we go to break, we'd like to share a little bit about showers of blessing. Ask Linda and Ken if they will join me. Linda and Ken. Linda and Ken are the operations manager, Linda, and Ken is the new general manager. Not so new, 9 months.
Homeless men and women will have a chance to take regular showers thanks to a portable shower. The Christ Lutheran Church raised more than $30,000 in donations to buy the trailer with 2 showers. The shower trailer will be operated by the nonprofit HEAL, which stands for Health, Empowerment, and Love. Coordinators named the truck Showers of Blessings.
God promises showers. God promises a shower of blessings for all, saying, I will send down the showers in their season. They shall be showers of blessing. Christ Lutheran Church in Goleta sees the need for God's work in the face of every homeless child, every homeless woman, and every homeless man. They not only see the need, they use their hands to build ecumenical partnerships with others to do God's work.
Came here 6 years ago, and in looking at the congregation, one of the things that really jumped out at me was the congregation that's small but cares a lot about the community. Over the years in working with the homeless, their first concern was a safe place to sleep at night. So we support the safe parking program with a group called New Beginnings. We're a parking place for them. We allocate 5 slots where people can park here at night. We provide restroom facilities for the people to use while they're sleeping in their cars. There's also the need for clothes and for laundry facilities. So the idea came up of why don't we see how we can do some showers. There isn't any space here for showers, and that doesn't serve the need because the people aren't necessarily here. They're in the local community. So how do you get out to the community? And that's where the idea of, okay, mobile showers.
Caring for homeless people is not a single church's responsibility, and no single group or person can address the whole problem. And since no one person can care for this community, everyone is responsible, every Christian, every community member, regardless of faith tradition.
Before a person goes into the shower, we have bins of clothes that they pick out, clothes that they recycle, and then they put their old clothes in this bag, and we tag them with their names, and then we take it home and wash them so that next week they can come back and get their clothes washed, and then they take their old clothes again and put in the bag, and we continually recycle their clothes, and they get clean clothes every time they take a shower.
I was homeless myself at one time, and to be able to have a facility or service like this helped me get my life back on track and put my life in order again. And once I worked on myself, I was able to give back and help other people in the same situation. Now I'm the operations manager for the showers, and I could help. And it was God driven. I mean, I prayed a lot about wanting to give back to the people that I once lived out with, you know, in the streets. And now I can give back and help them and show them that it can be done.
The homeless participants also have a lot to share about the showers.
I've been many places in the country, and in each area, some things are hard to get, some things are easy to get. Here it's difficult to get a shower. So before this thing was here, you just had to try to meet somebody with an apartment or go all the way to Santa Barbara.
The families of St. Mark's Catholic Church host the trailer once a week and provide warm food to the homeless men and women.
The normal shower trailer comes with a single waste tank. When we ordered the shower trailer, we made a design change. We had them split it apart, so there's a black water tank, which is from the toilets, and a gray water tank, which is all the water from the showers. We can then use that water from the showers, take it out, through the hose, over, and water the plants. We're using it on the shrubs and all the plants here at the different churches.
Pastor Ron Cox from Christ Lutheran shares the true objective of the ministry often. It's to change community attitudes, help the people with and end the scourge of homelessness. The issue of hygiene speaks to their perception of self-worth, being able to look for work, and community public health. And they deserve so much more.